friends and all new friends. Oh my gosh, there are so many new people here. Unless last week's video, I am the actual Nikki Liam, not Bernadette Banner, obviously. But welcome. So for this year's winter ball at Castel de Ursel, I am in need of a Belle Epoque ball gown. Now, because I have a limited time and limited resources, I'm going to revise a costume that I've already worn previously at a ball at Hasbrook, which had the theme of Belarus. Now, even though I like the convenience of the secret pants, I do miss the swishy skirt when dancing. So I'm going to make a new skirt for this. Now, the bodice was actually not made by me. I bought this at a costume sale of the Dutch Opera Touring Company for an absolute steal. It was made for La Traviata and the costume design is by Reis. And this was the only photo I could find that had my bodice in it. Now for this production of La Traviata, this bodice was worn with a silk black dupioni skirt over a crinoline. Usually theatrical costumes are not historically accurate and usually over the top, dramatically embellished. This bodice is no exception, as you can tell by the heavily beaded Bertha. Now the bodice is made out of a gold silk covered with black lace and flatlined with a sturdy black couture. The edges are finished with some black silk piping. Now I cannot tell you if the beaded trim was custom made for this, but this is absolutely beautiful. You can tell it has some wear and tear in some places, but still in good condition. The bodice closes in the back and is mainly covered with a beaded trim that is attached with a hook at the shoulder and poppers along the neckline. The back has a false lace closing with a hook and eye closing underneath for quick changes. As you can tell, there are multiple rows of bars here, which is very common when multiple actors share one costume. The construction of the bodice is typical for theater costumes. All the seams and bonings are accessible for easy alterations. Inside the bodice you can still see the company's production label with a vague hint of the actress' name. As you can see, there are 5 pieces of buttonhole elastic. These are attached to the buttons sewn on the inside of the waistbands of skirts. This is to prevent a gap from showing when the actor lifts their arms, but also helps getting dressed faster as the skirt and bodice are treated as a dress instead of separates, but leaves the option to switch skirts for different actresses. Now, is this going to be a true 1890s ball gown? Not really. This production was set in the 1850s, but I think with some alterations to the bodice and a different skirt for a different silhouette, it can just pass fine as 1890s. Now, I do not own a S-band corset, nor do I have time to make one, so I will just wear my 1870s corset underneath. But to be fair, I kind of wear that corset for all of my 19th century costumes. So basically you can say that I'm continuing the legacy of this theater costume by making a theatrical interpretation of an 1890s costume. Basically you can say it's a Frankenstein hot mess. Per usual, I start out by cutting out the pattern pieces. I'm using a black silk taffeta that I bought last time I was in Paris. Luckily there was no obvious shiny side, which meant I could lay my patterns upside down as well to minimize fabric waste. As I plan to have a train on this skirt, I cut some extra length at the hem and then used tailor tacks to mark my original hemline. To make tailor tacks, you basically sew a rough basting stitch, but instead of pulling the thread until it lays smooth, you leave a loop. Then when you separate the 2 layers, you span the thread in the middle and cut it. This way you have both your pattern pieces marked. Usually I do this with basting thread, but as this will leave too big a holes in the silk, I use the double machine thread. Then I use the silk pieces to cut out the cotton organdy fabric to flatline the skirt with. And use tracing paper and a tracing wheel to transfer the hemline onto the cotton. Then on the cotton I mark 10 inches up of the hemline to mark where the tarlatan hem will go. Adding tarlatan to the hem will help make the hem stand out and get that full Belle Epoque fullness in the skirt. After cutting out the tarlatan pieces, I pin them between the cotton and the silk layers. I then use the zigzag stitch to sew them onto the cotton. Once those were in place, I could baste and serge all the layers together with the exception of the hem. Before sewing the center back, I thread marked the pleats in the back. Then I could finally start assembling the pieces together. When seams are on the bias, like with the gored skirt panel, always work from the widest to the smallest part, in this case from hem to waist, to prevent stretching out the seams. Before sewing the side seams, I added pockets on both sides of the skirt. For a full tutorial on how I construct pockets, I'll put the link in the description down below. Once all side seams were sewn, I let the dress hang out overnight. Letting a garment hang out overnight before sewing the hem gives it time to settle in its new form, especially when you're working with larger volumes that add weight, causing the hem to sag and become uneven. After seeing the skirt hang out on the dress form with the bodice, I felt very underwhelmed by the simplicity of the skirt compared with the over-the-top beadwork of the bodice. So I decided to pimp it up and add some more dimension to it. I cut out the whole skirt again with the exception of the front panel from a silk organza to add on top of the silk taffeta skirt. Because organza is very prone to fraying and see-through, I used a French seam to prevent the skirt from tearing at the seams. So instead of sewing the right sides together, I sewed the wrong sides together. Pressed the seam to one side and then pressed again, folded right onto the seam. And sewed the seam again, but this time with the right sides together. This way the raw edges of the first seam are enclosed in the second seam. I finished the opening at center back with the rolled hem, which is rather tricky combined with a French seam. So I have to admit, this was not my finest work. Then I merged the two skirts together at the waist and added the waistband. For this, I'll also add the link to the full tutorial in the description down below. After I let the silk organza skirt hang out overnight, Melchior helped me by pinning the new hemline with the train in the back. While letting the skirt sit on the dress form, I basted the new hemline through all 3 layers and then cut off any excess fabric but leaving a 5 cm hem. After serging and pressing the hem up, I machine stitched it down. Usually I would hand sew the hem with a herringbone stitch for it not to show on the outside. But with the silk organza layer on top of it and running out of time, I couldn't be bothered much. With the new hem in place on a taffeta skirt, I could copy the hem on the organza layer, which I finished with a 1 cm rolled hem. So let me tell you a little bit about me being in a rush and not really have my full heart in this project. As you can see, my rolled hems are not as neat. Frankly, I don't really care at this point. Yeah, time is running out. You won't be able to see this probably, hopefully, when over the skirt, because, you know, now you can see, but with the black underneath, it won't be that noticeable. But yeah, this is me being in a rush and fiddly fabric and just not caring anymore. So yeah. Once the skirts were done construction-wise, it was time to go nuts with the embellishments. trying somehow to marry this skirt with its out there bodice by buying all the shiny trims at my local passementerie, which unfortunately is closing next year due to retirement. For the organza skirt, I used a black braided trim adorned with black sequins to mirror the sparkles from the bodice. I used a 6 cm white piece of paper as a guide to pin the trim in place. Then I added 3 rows of tassels and beaded trim to the front panel of the taffeta skirt and added the same tassel trim to the vertical edges of the organza skirt. To prevent the organza skirt leading its own life while dancing, I used a 2 cm long hand crochet swing catcher on every seam between the 2 layers. This is a great way to attach 2 layers of fabric while still keeping the dimension of the 2. To finish the skirt, I sewed on hooks and eyes and some small poppers to keep the center back closed. And for this too, I'll leave the links to the full tutorial in the description down below. Now that the skirt was done, I wanted to soften the silhouette of the bodice a bit. So I experimented with some sleeve shapes. First I tried a butterfly sleeve shown here. But in combination with the stiffness of the organza was a little bit too much. So eventually I settled on a flutter sleeve which has lesser volume. After drawing out the 2 sleeves on the organza, I used one of my decorative stitches on my machine on the hem of the sleeves. And gave them a good press before roughly cutting them out. And then I went in for the precise cutting, where my new antique sewing buddy came in extra handy. And last but not least, I sewed the sleeves on by hand between the shoulder strap and the beadwork, making sure to stretch out the elastic shoulder strap when sewing on the sleeves. As a final touch, I looped the beaded shoulder strands up instead of letting them hang as per original. In my opinion, I thought it helped soften the look even more. And now for the final reveal. Now, trying to film a black garment and its black details is not ideally in a dimly lit castle. So I had to crank up the exposure a lot, but hopefully you can still see it well enough. Even though I have a vast dislike of the color black and not felt my colorful self at the start of the ball, I'll have to admit, the look started to grow on me throughout the evening. And that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you next time. Bye!